Chapter 4. The Illumination of the Self. In illumination, we come to that state of consciousness which is popularly supposed to be peculiar to the mystic, a form of mental life, a kind of perception radically different from that of normal men. His preceding adventures and experiences cannot be allowed this quality. His awakening to the consciousness of the Absolute, though often marked by a splendor and intensity which seem to distinguish it from other psychic upheavals of that kind, does but reproduce upon higher levels those characteristic processes of conversion and falling in love which give depth and actuality to the religious and passional life. The purification to which he then sets himself, though this possesses as a rule certain features peculiar to mystical development, is again closely related to the disciplines and mortifications of ascetic, but not necessarily mystical piety. It is the most exalted form with which we are acquainted of that catharsis, that pruning and training of the human plant, which is the essence of all education and a necessary stage in every kind of transcendence. Here, the mystic does but adopt in a more drastic form the principles which all who would live with an intense life, all seekers after freedom, all true lovers must accept, that he may justly claim with Ophelia that these wear their rue with a difference. But in the great swing back into sunshine, which is the reward of that painful descent into the cell of self-knowledge, he parts company with these other pilgrims. Those who still go with him a little way, certain prophets, poets, artists, dreamers, do so in virtue of that mystical genius, that instinct for transcendental reality, of which all seers and creators have some trace, the initiates of beauty or of wisdom, as the great mystic is the initiate of love. They share in some degree the experiences of the way of illumination. But the mystic has now a veritable foothold in that transcendental world into which they penetrate now and again, enjoys a certain fellowship, not yet union, with the great life of the all, and thence draws strength and peace, really and actually, as one whose novitiate is finished. He has entered the inner choir, where the soul joineth hands and danceth with Sophia, the divine wisdom, and keeping time with the great rhythms of the spiritual universe, feels that he has found his place. This change of consciousness, however abrupt and amazing it may seem to the self which experiences it, seems to the psychologist a normal phase in that organic process of development which was initiated by the awakening of the transcendental sense, responding to the intimations received in that awakening, ordering itself in their interest, concentrating its scattered energies on this one thing, the self emerges from long and varied acts of purification to find that it is able to apprehend another order of reality. It has achieved consciousness of a world that was always there, and wherein its substantial being, that ground which is of God, has always stood. Such a consciousness is transcendental feeling, in excelsis, a deep, intuitional knowledge of the secret plan. We are like a choir who stand round the conductor, says Plotinus, but do not always sing in tune, because their attention is diverted by looking at external things. So we always move round the one. If we did not, we should dissolve and cease to exist. But we do not always look towards the one. Hence, instead of that free and conscious cooperation in the great life of the all, which alone can make personal life worth living, we move like slaves or marionettes, and, oblivious of the whole to which our little steps contribute, fail to observe the measure whereto the worlds keep time. Our minds, being distracted from the Coryphaeus in the midst of the energetic Word, who sets the rhythm, we do not behold him. We are absorbed in the illusions of sense. The eye which looks on eternity is idle. But when we do behold him, says Plotinus again, we attain the end of our existence and our rest. Then we no longer sing out of tune, but form a truly divine chorus about him, in the which chorus dance the soul beholds the fountain of life, the fountain of intellect, the principle of being, the cause of good, the root of soul. Such a beholding, such a lifting of consciousness from a self-centered to a God-centered world is of the essence of illumination. It will be observed that in these passages, the claim of the mystic is not yet to supreme communion, the spiritual marriage of the Christian mystic, or that flight of the alone to the alone, which is the Plotinian image for the utmost bliss of the emancipated soul. He has now got through preliminaries, detached himself from his chief entanglements, reoriented his instinctive life. The result is a new and solid certitude about God and his own soul's relation to God, an enlightenment in which he is adjusted to new standards of conduct and thought. In the traditional language of asceticism, he is proficient, but not yet perfect. He achieves a real vision and knowledge, a conscious harmony with the divine world of becoming, not yet self-loss in the principle of life, but rather a willing and harmonious revolution about him, that in dancing he may know what is done. This character distinguishes almost every first-hand description of illumination, and it is this which marks it off from mystic union in all its forms. All pleasurable and exalted states of mystic consciousness, in which the sense of I-hood persists, in which there is a loving and joyous relation between the absolute as object and the self as subject, fall under the head of illumination, which is really an enormous development of the intuitional life at high levels, all veritable and first-hand apprehensions of the divine obtained by the use of symbols, as in the religious life, all the degrees of prayer lying between meditation and the prayer of union, many phases of poetic inspiration and glimpses of truth, are activities of the illuminated mind. To see God in nature, to attain a radiant consciousness of the otherness of natural things, is the simplest and commonest form of illumination. Most people, under the spell of emotion or of beauty, have known flashes of rudimentary vision of this kind. Where such a consciousness is recurrent, as it is in many poets, there results that partial yet often overpowering apprehension of the infinite life immanent in all living things, which some modern writers have dignified by the name of nature mysticism. Where it is raised to its highest denomination till the veil is obliterated by the light behind, and faith has vanished into sight, as sometimes happened to Blake, we reach the point at which the mystic swallows up the poet. Dear Sir, says that great genius in one of his most characteristic letters, written immediately after an onset of the illuminated vision which he had lost for many years, excuse my enthusiasm, or rather madness, for I am really drunk with intellectual vision whenever I take a pencil or graver into my hand. Many a great painter, philosopher, or poet, perhaps every inspired musician, has known this indescribable inebriation of reality in those moments of transcendence in which his masterpieces were conceived. This is the saving madness of which Plato speaks in the Phaedrus, the ecstasy of the God-intoxicated man, the lover, the prophet, and the poet drunk with life. When the Christian mystic, eager for his birthright, says, Sanguis Christi inebria me, he is asking for just such a gift of supernal vitality, a draught of that wine of absolute life which runs in the arteries of the world. Those to whom that cup is given attain to an intenser degree of vitality, hence to a more acute degree of perception, a more vivid consciousness than that which is enjoyed by other men. For though, as Ruysbroeck warns us, this is not God, yet it is for many selves the light in which we see him. Blake conceived that it was his vocation to bring this mystical illumination, this heightened vision of reality, within the range of ordinary men, to cleanse the doors of perception of the race. They thought him a madman for his pains. Quote, I rest not upon my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards into the worlds of thought, into eternity, forever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. O Savior, pour upon me thy spirit of meekness and love, annihilate the selfhood in me. Be thou all my life. Unquote. The mysteries of the antique world appear to have been attempts, often by way of a merely magical initiation, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards, exalt his powers of perception until they could receive the messages of a higher degree of reality. In spite of much eager theorizing, it is impossible to tell how far they succeeded in this task. To those who had a natural genius for the infinite, symbols and rituals which were doubtless charged with ecstatic suggestions and often dramatized the actual course of the mystic way, may well have brought some enhancement of consciousness, though hardly that complete rearrangement of character which is an essential of the mystic's entrance on the true illuminated state. Hence, Plato only claims that he whose initiation is recent can see immortal beauty under mortal veils. Quote, O blessed he in all wise, who hath drunk the living fountain, whose life no folly staineth, and whose soul is near to God, whose sins are lifted pall-wise as he worships on the mountain. Unquote. Thus sang the initiates of Dionysus, that mystery cult in which the Greeks seem to have expressed all they knew of the possible movement of consciousness through rites of purification to the ecstasy of the illuminated life. The mere crude rapture of illumination has seldom been more vividly expressed. With its half-oriental fervors, its self-regarding glory and personal purification achieved, and the spiritual superiority conferred by adeptship, may be compared the deeper and lovelier experience of the Catholic poet and saint who represents the spirit of Western mysticism at its best. His sins, too, had been lifted pall-wise as a cloud melts in the sunshine of divine love. But here the center of interest is not the little self which has been exalted, but the greater self which deigns thus to exalt. Quote, O burn that burns to heal, O more than pleasant wound, and O soft hand, O touch most delicate, that dost new life reveal, that dost in grace abound, and, slaying, dost from death to life translate. Unquote. Here the joy is as passionate, the consciousness of an exalted life as intense, but it is dominated by the distinctive Christian concepts of humility, surrender, and intimate love. We have seen that all real artists, as well as all pure mystics, are sharers to some degree in the illuminated life. They have drunk with Blake from that cup of intellectual vision, which is the chalice of the spirit of life, know something of its divine inebriation whenever beauty inspires them to create. Some have only sipped it. Some, like John of Parma, have drunk deep, accepting in that act the mystic heritage with all its obligations. But to all who have seen beauty face to face, the grail has been administered, and through that sacramental communion they are made participants in a mystery of the world. In one of the most beautiful passages of the Fioretti, it is told how Brother Jacques of La Massa, unto whom God opened the door of his secrets, saw in a vision this chalice of the Spirit of life delivered by Christ into the hands of St. Francis, that he might give his brothers to drink thereof. Then came St. Francis to give the chalice of life to his brothers, and he gave it first to Brother John of Parma, who, taking it, drank it all in haste, devoutly, and straightway he became all shining like the sun. And after him St. Francis gave it to all the other brothers in order, and there were but few among them that took it with due reverence and devotion and drank it all. Those that took it devoutly and drank it all became straightway shining like the sun, but those that spilled it all and took it not devoutly became black and dark and misshapen and horrible to see, but those that drank part and spilled part became partly shining and partly dark, and more so or less according to the measure of their drinking or spilling thereof. But the aforesaid Brother John was resplendent above all the rest, the which had more completely drunk the chalice of life, whereby he had the more deeply gazed into the abyss of the infinite light divine. No image, perhaps, could suggest so accurately as this divine picture the conditions of perfect illumination, the drinking deeply, devoutly, and in haste, that is, without prudent and self-regarding hesitation, of the heavenly wine of life, that wine of which Rowley says that it fulfills the soul with a great gladness through a sweet contemplation. John of Parma, the hero of these spiritual Franciscans, in whose interest this exquisite allegory was composed, stands for all the mystics who, having completely drunk, have attained the power of gazing into the abyss of the infinite light divine. In those imperfect brothers who dared not drink the cup of sacrifice to the dregs, but took part and spilled part, so that they became partly shining and partly dark, according to the measure of their drinking or spilling thereof, we may see an image of the artist, musician, prophet, poet, dreamer, more or less illuminated according to the measure of courage and self-abandonment in which he has drunk the cup of ecstasy, but always in comparison with the radiance of the pure contemplative, partly shining and partly dark. Hinder me not, says the soul to the senses in Mechthild of Magdeburg's vision, I would drink for a space of the unmingled wine. In the artist, the senses have somewhat hindered the perfect inebriation of the soul. We have seen that a vast tract of experience, all the experience which results from contact between a purged and heightened consciousness and the world of becoming in which it is immersed, and much, too, of that which results from contact set up between such a consciousness and the Absolute itself, is included in that stage of growth which all the mystics call the illuminative way. This is the largest and most densely populated province of the mystic kingdom. Such different visionaries as Suso and Blake, Bohemi and Angela of Foligno, Meckfield of Magdeburg, Fox, Rowley, St. Teresa, and countless others have left us in the record of their sojourn therein. Amongst those who cannot be called pure mystics, we can detect in the works of Plato and Heraclitus, Wordsworth, Tennyson, and Walt Whitman indications that they too were acquainted beyond most poets and seers with the phenomena of the illuminated life. In studying it, then, we shall be confronted by a mass of apparently irreconcilable material, the results of the relations set up between every degree of lucidity, every kind of character, and the supersensible world. To say that God is infinite is to say that he may be apprehended and described in an infinity of ways. That circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere may be approached from every angle with a certainty of being found. Mystical history, particularly that which deals with the illuminative way, is a demonstration of this fact. Here, in the establishment of the first mystic life of conscious correspondence with reality, the self which has oscillated between two forms of consciousness has alternately opposed and embraced its growing intuitions of the absolute, comes for a time to rest. To a large extent, the discordant elements of character have been purged away. Temporally, at least, the mind has unified itself upon high levels and attained, as it believes, a genuine consciousness of the divine and veritable world. The depth and richness of its own nature will determine how intense that consciousness shall be. Whatever its scope, however, this new apprehension of reality generally appears to the illuminated self as final and complete. As the true lover is always convinced that he has found in his bride the one rose of the world, so the mystic, in the first glow of his initiation, is sure that his quest is now fulfilled. Ignorant as yet of that consummation of love which overpasses the proceedings of the inward eye and ear, he exclaims with entire assurance, Beati oculi qui exterioribus clausi interioribus autem sunt intenti. And, absorbed in this new blissful act of vision, forgets that it belongs to those who are still in via. He has yet to pass through that night of the senses in which he learns to distinguish the substance of reality from the accidents under which it is perceived, to discover that the heavenly food here given cannot satisfy his hunger for the absolute. His true goal lies far beyond this joyful basking in the sunbeams of the uncreated light. Only the greatest souls learn this lesson and tread the whole of that king's highway which leads man back to his source. For the many that come to Bethlehem, there be few that will go on to Calvary. The rest stay here in this earthly paradise, these flowery fields, where the liberated self wanders at will, describing to us as well as it can, now this corner, now that of the country of the soul. It is in these descriptions of the joy of illumination, in the outpourings of love and rapture belonging to this state, that we find the most lyrical passages of mystical literature. Here poet, mystic, and musician are on common ground, for it is only by the oblique methods of the artist, by the use of aesthetic suggestion and musical rhythm, that the wonder of that vision can be expressed. When essential goodness, truth, and beauty, light, life, and love are apprehended by the heart, whether the heart be that of poet, painter, lover, or saint, that apprehension can only be communicated in a living, that is to say, an artistic form. The natural mind is conscious only of succession. The special differentia of the mystic is the power of apprehending simultaneity. In the peculiarities of the illuminated consciousness, we recognize the effort of the mind to bridge the gap between simultaneity and succession, the characters of creator and creation. Here the successive is called upon to carry the values of the eternal. Here, then, genius and sanctity kiss one another, and each, in that sublime encounter, looks for an instant through the other's eyes. Hence, it is natural and inevitable that the mystic should here call to play all the resources of artistic expression. The lovely imagery of Julian and Meckfield of Magdeburg, Suso's poetic visions, St. Augustine's fire and light, the heavenly harmonies of St. Francis and Richard Rowland. Symbols, too, play a major part, not only in the description, but also in the machinery of illumination. The intuitions of many mystics presenting themselves directly to the surface mind in a symbolic form. We must therefore be prepared for a great variety and fluidity of expression, a constant and not always conscious recourse to symbol and image in those who try to communicate the secret of this state of consciousness. We must examine and even classify, so far as possible, a wide variety of experience, some which is recognized by friends and foes alike as purely mystical, some in which the operation of poetic imagination is clearly discernible, some which involves psychic phenomena and other abnormal activities of the mind, refusing to be frightened away from investigation by the strange and apparently irreconcilable character of our material. There are three main types of experience which appear again and again in the history of mysticism, nearly always in connection with illumination, rather than any other phase of mystical development. I think that they may fairly be regarded as its main characteristics, though the discussion of them cannot cover all the ground. In few forms of spiritual life is the spontaneity of the individual so clearly seen as here, and in few is the ever deadly process of classification attended to with so many risks. These three characteristics are: number one, a joyous apprehension of the absolute, that which many ascetic writers call the presence or the practice of the presence of God. This, however, is not to be confused with that unique consciousness of union with the divine, which is peculiar to a later stage of mystical development. The self, though purified, still realizes itself as a separate entity over against God. It is not immersed in its origin, but contemplates it. This is the betrothal rather than the marriage of the soul. Number two, this clarity of vision may also be enjoyed in regard to the phenomenal world. The actual physical perceptions seem to be strangely heightened, so that the self perceives an added significance and reality in all natural things, is often convinced that it knows at last the secret of the world. In Blake's words, the doors of perception are cleansed, so that everything appears to man as it is, infinite. In these two forms of perception, we see the growing consciousness of the mystic stretching in two directions until it includes in its span both the world of being and the world of becoming. The dual apprehension of reality is transcendent yet immanent, which we found to be one of the distinguishing marks of the mystic type. Number three, along with this twofold extension of consciousness, the energy of the intuitional or transcendental self may be enormously increased. The psychic upheavals of the purgative way have tended to make it central for life, to eliminate from the character all those elements which checked its activity. Now it seizes upon the ordinary channels of expression and may show itself in such forms as A. Auditions, B. Dialogues between the surface consciousness and another intelligence which purports to be divine, C. Visions, and sometimes D. in automatic writings. In many selves, this automatic activity of those growing but still largely subconscious powers which constitute the new man increases steadily during the whole of the mystic life. Illumination, then, tends to appear mainly under one or all of these three forms. Often all are present, though as a rule one is dominant. The balance of characteristics will be conditioned in each case by the self's psychic makeup, its temperamental leaning towards pure contemplation, lucid vision, or automatic expression, emanation or immanence, the metaphysical, artistic, or intimate aspects of truth. The possible combinations between these various factors are as innumerable as the possible creations of life itself. In the wonderful rhapsodies of St. Augustine, in St. Bernard's Converse with the Word, in Angela of Foligno's Apprehensions of Deity, in Richard Rowley's State of Song, when sweetest heavenly melody he took with him dwelling in mind, or in Brother Lawrence's Practice of the Presence of God, we may see varied expressions of the first type of illuminated consciousness. Jacob Bohemi is rightly looked upon as a classic example of the second, which is also found in one of its most attractive forms in St. Francis of Assisi. Suso and St. Teresa perhaps may stand for the third, since in them the visionary and auditory phenomena were particularly well marked. A further study of each characteristic in order will help us to disentangle the many threads which go to the psychical makeup of these great and complex mystic types. The rest of this chapter will, then, be given to the analysis of the two chief forms of illuminated consciousness: the self's perception of reality in the eternal and temporal worlds. The important subject of voices and visions demands a division to itself.